we are now live on Facebook, or just about. So as folks come in, I will mute you. So don't take any offense to that.
Sorry.
Okay, I don't see other folks waiting to come in quite yet, but we give people just another minute or two. It is right now 7 o'clock, so. Thank you everybody for joining us tonight, and for folks who are tuning in on Facebook. We've got several people who are watching on Facebook as well. I'll just give folks another minute or two to join us, and then we'll go from there. I want to be sure to point out that the things on the table over my right shoulder, those are cranes that my son folded, origami cranes. It's not just clutter. They serve a purpose there. So, and I wonder, there is a setting that I wonder if we can do. I think we can only do one at a time. So I didn't know, Woody, I didn't know if we could put the two of us up at the same time, but I'm gonna I'm going to make you the spotlight for the time being, and then as we get into the discussion, then I'll add more folks' names. So so thank you again, Woody, for agreeing to take part of this. And as I had mentioned in my updates about this program, Dr. Woody Register is professor of history at the University of the South, and your chair has a name, and I've forgotten the name, but thank you to those who established the chair. Yeah. And Woody is also the director of the Roberson Project on Slavery, Race, and Reconciliation at Sewanee. And we met last November, I guess, at a workshop that the Roberson Project put on about Confederate memorials in Episcopal churches. And so I got to learn a little bit about the work of the Roberson Center, and and some of Woody's research. But Woody, can you tell us just a little bit about your background and about the work y'all are doing there?
Sure, happy to do so, and thank you for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to join the conversation with you and the members of your parish community. So I teach history at Sewanee, and I have been teaching history at Sewanee for quite a while now. I teach U.S. history, of course, for the most part, and I'm also a graduate of Sewanee, class of 1980. So, I have spent a good part of my life, not just my adult life, I guess, here on top of the mountain. For the last 3 years, and really for a year or so before that, I have been the director of the Roberson Project at Sewanee. Conversations about that project started in late 2015, 2016. This was a time when other universities in the Eastern US, in particular the University of Virginia, Emory, William and Mary, and probably best known at this time, Georgetown, had undertaken significant internal examinations, historical studies of their own universities, the way they were implicated in slavery, the way those who had built fortunes as on slavery-based plantations, not just in the American colonies in North America, but also in the Caribbean, had played significant roles in building up the colleges that started in the colonial era and then continued into the national era in the United States. So they did this because universities like to tell good stories about themselves, and to talk about your history with slavery is really not to tell a good story about yourself. It doesn't fit into, all universities want to be ancient, right? They want to have deep roots in the soil of America. I mean, the more ancient you are, the more eminent you are. Yet the problem in the United States is the more ancient you are, the more problematic it becomes once you start looking at your historical connections or even historical reliance on slavery for your existence. And the study at Georgetown in particular, which focused on that institution's sale of 272, it was believed at the time, enslaved persons from the Jesuits' Maryland plantations to Louisiana. That, and people at Georgetown, this was no secret at Georgetown, but it was only through pressure applied by students that they began seeing this as something they needed to address directly. Right. And so we joined this this group of institutions that called Universities Studying Slavery, and we began to think about how we might do something like this too, because Sewanee's own history with slavery is quite thick, even though Sewanee's existence, the existence of the University of the South, really only begins in at the earliest 1856. So that is about 5 years before the beginning of the Civil War. So, the Sewanee had always tried to tell a story that, we dodged a bullet. A student never even matriculated at the University of the South until 1868 and 1869. So we dodged the slavery bullet. But, and so we could tell a story about ourselves as really a church university, a university founded to represent and to educate based on the the principles and the values of the Episcopal Church.
Uh-huh.
So that story held up pretty well, but it doesn't hold up well under scrutiny.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
So we began this project in 2017. We've just finished our third year. We're continuing into the future, digging into our history, and then trying to change how we tell the story of this university, one that's certainly includes slavery, but also it tells the truth about the university's origins and its long history with, well, really with racial injustice and Jim Crow.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the reasons for us why Sewanee in particular is significant, and your discussion at Sewanee is significant, is your existence as an institution of the Episcopal Church. And Calvary is obviously an institution of the Episcopal Church, also founded in the second half of the 1850s. So yeah, just barely, yeah, in a sense, just barely touching on that, and at the same time being established on a piece of property that was carved out of a family's plantation, you know. What both for Sewanee in particular as an institution and for the Episcopal Church in general, and we could spend 2 hours probably on any question that I ask you, so this is a challenge. What sort of, can you give the broad contours of the relationship between the church and between slaveholding people before the Civil War?
Yeah, well, the history of slavery and the history of the Episcopal Church in the first half of the 19th century goes well beyond overlapping. They're really inseparable in the South, especially. In the South, the Episcopal Church, was very, very small in comparison to, say, the Methodists or the Baptists, and so the numbers were very small. But those numbers had a lot of money and a lot of power, financial as well as political power. The Episcopal Church in the South was regarded as the church of the master class. One of the principal founders of Sewanee, the most important figure, was Bishop Leonidas Polk, a native North Carolinian. North Carolina is a very important part of his story. Polk, the Bishop of Louisiana, was in part sent there to be the first bishop of Louisiana because he was himself the owner of between 300 and 400 persons. Mm-hmm. He bought a sugar plantation in Louisiana, and he operated out of that plantation. He oversaw, we don't know the exact number, but close to as many as 400 enslaved persons on that plantation while he was bishop until 1854 when he sold it. So, but he was, he's chosen in a way because he can walk shoulder to shoulder with the planters of Louisiana. He can look them look them, eye to eye as an equal. Mm-hmm. So, and he evangelizes among the master class, even while simultaneously urging, pressuring the master class to evangelize their slaves. So when the Episcopal Church then saw itself as, or these Episcopal bishops who founded the university thought that the Episcopal Church was the only institution that could hold the region together, the plantation states, they called it, because they had the interest of, you know, a disproportionate um, number of the kind of power elite of the South at that time in the church. So they proposed this university to be of the South. And when they
Uh-huh.
said of the South, of course, they meant of the slaveholding South.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Well, and there's I think a very sort of both Anglican and Episcopal um, move there that it, on the one hand, uh, looks to build unity, looks to draw people together, sees itself as a societal and cultural force, and on the other hand, um, doesn't always have a very expansive view of what society is. You know, uh, and like you say, may focus on a particular subset of society as representative of the whole. Um, so uh, there's both an an encouraging move in terms of um, again that kind of social cohesion, but a real blindness when it comes to uh, who needs to be held together. And that's one of the things as we talked about the kind of the history of the church after the Civil War that really struck me is the role that the church took on, and perhaps the university too, in that period.
Well, certainly, um, so Bishop Stephen Elliott of Georgia, who had been I guess, the equivalent of the presiding bishop of the Protestant Episcopal Church of the Confederate States of America when the church split off.
Uh-huh.
So Elliott is the only one of the major bishops who founded the university who survived the Civil War. He survived until he died in the end of 1866, I think in December. So Elliott is the one who then um, plays a role in healing the rift within the National Episcopal Church. And he's often celebrated for this because he accepted the defeat of the Confederacy as the will of God, the end of slavery as God's will too. So he doesn't fight against that. But the conditions that he lays down for reconciliation of the two sides is there must be no criticism of those who fought for the Confederacy. There
Uh-huh.
must be no questioning or doubt that the men who risked their lives or laid down their lives did so for a noble and worthy cause.
Uh-huh.
So even then, he's formulating what will become the kind of ideological planks of the lost cause when it begins taking vital shape in the 1870s and 1880s. He's avant-garde in this way. It's almost like a plan of action. And he's not the only one by any means, but he does see a role for the church in the South, and in standing up for the values for which they fought, and not apologizing for slavery, and not conceding that, believing that slavery did not have its benefits, as he insisted. It uplifted a barbarous people into the light of true religion. So God has ended slavery, but God had used slavery when it existed for godly purposes.
Right.
So, and this is and so the university, and I think the Episcopal Church, as they become kind of shrines or assembly places for persons who become the kind of iconography of the lost cause. That relationship develops early, and it persists and it grows over time. And we certainly see that at Sewanee. You can certainly see it in your churchyard in the odd ways that it developed, I guess, in the 1920s and 30s.
Right, right. Well, and in developing that iconography and in developing that that ethos, and it's an ethos that's so powerful that I can remember as a child growing up in Franklin, Tennessee, and Franklin is a very historic. There's a major battle in the Civil War fought there. Having this sense that when they did reenactments, I honestly wondered where they found people to take the Union side.
Yeah.
Because just as a child growing up in that environment, it just seemed like the cause was so noble, whatever that meant, and so it's very, very powerful. And another thing that struck me in our discussion in November was the ways in which that iconography and that language became and has become proxy for a number of other concerns. The one that struck me was that, I wonder what. Let me ask you to comment on that a little bit before I go too far with it. So,
can you say a little bit more, Jay, about what you mean by proxy?
Well, I was about to say that in talking about the times that, in particular, that the use of the Confederate battle flag has sprung up, and times when discussions about around the Civil War had been particularly strong, that we can track some of those to growth in civil rights, growth in voting rights, different movements to enfranchise African Americans, and, for instance, that some of that discussion grew stronger during the war in Vietnam, because we couldn't talk about the war in Vietnam, but we could talk about the Civil War. So I guess that's what just that the texture of the conversation has kind of grown beyond the specific individuals.
Well, it's absolutely true. When I was reading the newspaper article about your church and the rector McClellan starting this campaign to create the Westminster Abbey outdoors, and that he's not a Southerner. In fact, his ties are in just the opposite direction. But the first thought that came to my mind was, they still have a hard time finding people to play Union soldiers in reenactments. It makes perfect sense. It's the romance of the lost cause, the romance of the defeated South. That is a powerful lure for people of all stripes in this country, or has been. So it wasn't surprising in that way. But I'll give an example. This is something we've just come across in the last couple of days. We were trying to find out when, if you're familiar with this college fraternity ritual, this associated with the KA fraternity. Annually, they have an event called Old South. So we were trying to figure out what happened with these Old South celebrations at Sewanee. Well, we discovered that the first one was in 1952. And it was rather elaborate, and then it continues through the 50s into the 1960s. But the first was in 1952. They didn't do it before that. Now, if you know anything about the history of the Episcopal Church, as I'm sure y'all do, you know that in 1951 and 1952, the color line was broken in the Episcopal Church at Virginia, at Virginia Theological Seminary. The first Black student was admitted. And then Sewanee in 1952, the Board of Trustees voted not to accept African Americans, and then reversed itself the following year in 1953 and did allow for the admission of African Americans. So here we have the first Old South celebration at the University of the South in 1952, right? In the midst of this kind of turmoil, and there at the very center of it, delivering the speech is the Vice Chancellor of the university, who's leading behind the scenes the campaign to keep African Americans out of the School of Theology. So these kinds of arguments, these kinds of rituals, the monuments, they tend to appear at critical points of conflict, critical points of historical change. So you see this right at the beginning of the organized civil rights movement in the 1950s. So I don't think it's coincidental. And I think at your church too, I cannot help but think that there were many factors playing into the development of those memorials at your church, but they make sense within their own time. As historians will always tell you, if you want to know what a monument is about, what a memorial is about, don't try to figure out the history of the person memorialized. Try to figure out what was happening at the time the memorial was erected, and that's the history that you can learn from the monument, not you don't learn the history about the figure who's represented.
Right. Yeah, no, it's clear. Some of the discussions about whether or not a particular person is worthy of a monument, to me seem, they're almost beside the point, because they weren't necessarily erected. They were erected for that person, but the reason why that person was being remembered is more significant than who they are. So where do you think the discussion is now in terms of, for Sewanee, for instance, there's a significant institution in a beautiful setting that has a significant role to play in shaping culture, shaping students, forming community leaders in the decades to come. And the same is very much true of Calvary. There's a lot that we have to be grateful for, but how or should we even be concerned about not losing the fullness of our story as we go forward? Yeah. How do we shape our story? How are you thinking right now about how we shape our story going forward?
Well, I think that it's true in probably every case, but it's certainly true in places like our respected institutions, which are, the same age. We don't have one story. We have multiple stories. And for too long, one story has dominated. And there are additional stories that need to be brought in and told equally and simultaneously, so that you have a multiplicity of voices speaking about your institution and the role it has played, and how it has participated in the world and shaped the world around it. So for us, that's the critical thing. On one hand, we could just focus on, the masses, the enslaving class, and the deeds they did, the money they gave, the aspirations they had, and then we could talk about the succeeding generations of white men who guided and were educated at this institution. But that too would narrow the story too much. That would flatten it in a way that's not much better than the story that exists now. So what we're trying to do is to bring in other voices that have been overlooked over the generations, that can to tell a more inclusive history of our community, but by including more strands of narrative. So in particular, we are determined, and we've had good success already in this, in bringing the African Americans who have shaped the history of this institution since its very beginning, and without whom this institution would not even have come to anyone's mind, to bring them into the story, to bring their lives and their experiences and their contributions in on an equal footing, while at the same time, and this is critical, allowing them to tell their stories rather than having, talk about proxies, having me or someone like me functioning as a proxy to tell their story for them, because after all, I'm a historian, I can do it better. I can get at what's really important. No, we want to work with people to honor their voices and their experiences and their perspectives, and for them to do it for their benefit, not exclusively for ours. That makes sense. So it's this idea that there are multiple stories that are overlapping and intersecting, and
Right.
to all of them together.
Right. Well, and part of I'll kind of finish on this note and then open it up to folks, for anybody who'd like to ask questions. But part of what I find hopeful about that too is that we seem to think that the story or the narrative is there's only so much narrative we can tell. There's only so much, and if we focus on this, then we lose focus on that. But in the two periods that I've spent more than a little time studying, the American Revolution and the English Reformation, the more I understand the multiplicity of stories, the more I'm amazed at all of the stories, and the more that people become real people. And I'm amazed at what they were able to accomplish, because they seem more like me, and so I think that's, as we tell more stories, I think that's hopeful, because it gives us a richer sense of what's really happened, what's really been accomplished, and what else might be possible. So, yeah. Well, yeah. Again, thank you for this conversation. I'm going to unmute everybody, unless you mute yourself, and take you off of the spotlight, Woody, and invite y'all to ask your questions. So jump on in.
I like questions.
I was just wondering if you have had, as a university, to remove statues or stained glass windows telling stories that no longer seem appropriate, or that sort of thing, or perhaps placing them in a place where the history is still told, but it's not the prominent symbol. Has there been anything like that been going on that's similar to the conversation we're having around our monuments?
Yeah, so we have shifted things and removed things. And this began, well, it began even before Charlottesville. When a number of icons were taken out of service in the university and put into the archives. Now, I'm using passive voice here, and historians tell their students not to use passive voice. So, for instance, with this particular icon that's in use that was in use in our chapel, the chaplain decided enough, and he took it, had it removed, and taken over to the archives. We had about the icon that people are most familiar with, or at least those who've paid attention, is a UDC, a United Daughters of the Confederacy memorial to the Confederate General Edmund Kirby Smith. This was by the standards of Richmond, or even by the standards of your neck of the woods, this was a modest monument. It was never meant to be a modest monument, but since the planning for it began in the midst of the Depression, it never quite lived up to the dreams of the local UDC. But in any event, it was a large and conspicuous monument on the main University Avenue. Kirby Smith had been a mathematics professor at the university after the Civil War. So it has been removed. The vice chancellor, the president of the university, had it removed from that spot to the university cemetery. And then since then, the kind of base of the monument has been repurposed and rededicated to the values and aspirations we have today. So it's been taken away from the UDC model, and we've done a couple of. The chaplain has done quite a few things. He has a little chisel, and he has removed things. He removed the seal of the Confederacy, which was in a stained glass window in the chapel. Somebody just found him one day on a stepladder up there, taking it out. Now, we've done this, but I don't recommend it being done the way Sewanee has done it. I would not recommend it to y'all, and I know y'all are not considering this. That is, I actually would think that unilateral decision-making by people who are in positions of authority that solve a problem without giving the community a chance to address the underlying problem, the bigger problem. I think those are expedient. They take some of the pressure or concerns about troubling demonstrations, however you wish to put it. They keep those kinds of things from happening usually. But the problem, the wound, if you want to put it that way, in the community remains. Not the wound from removal, the wound already there that's been in existence for well over a century on our campus and well over a century in your churchyard. So those remain and remain unaddressed, and they remain a source of division and pain or lack of wholeness, which is something a university community aspires to, is certainly something that a church parish aspires to. So we have done that, but I am hoping that we have a lot of many memorials on our campus that have yet to be addressed and are not, so they can't just be stuck in the archive either, because they're part of the landscape. We have a lot of work left to do, and we're doing it. We have been doing it already, and it will continue this year. But I am very much an advocate of an inclusive and an honest and a truth telling, and in what will often be a painful kind of reckoning and process oriented decision, so that you don't just you try to get at what really matters to your community, instead of just solving the immediate problem of a noxious or an offensive memorial. To me, that doesn't work for long. It just pushes the problem maybe down the road, but also deeper into the world that you're trying to help. So that's my way of saying that we have done this in the past, and I'm not being critical of anyone. It's certainly not of the chaplain, whom I like and admire, and we are heart to heart on what he has been trying to do, and he has been a great friend of the work we've done. But I am hoping for a more searching and a more difficult, but a more lasting and a more healing process to happen here, because we have a lot that we have to address. It can't be avoided. It couldn't have been avoided 3 months ago. It certainly can't be avoided now.
I think I see the chair of our Buildings and Grounds Committee actually going and walking up the chisels right now. So, Andrew, did you have a comment or a question?
Yeah, Jay, thank you. Dr. Register, first off, thank you for your insightful comments. A bit of backdrop. I spent 7 formative years when I was doing an undergrad and a grad degree at the University of Richmond in Richmond. And for about 1.5 years, lived on Franklin Avenue. If you're familiar with Richmond, it runs parallel to Monument Ave. I couldn't help but notice that today, about 3 hours ago, Stonewall Jackson was no longer standing like a stone wall, right? He came down. Yesterday, the governor signed an order in Mississippi saying that flag had to come down. Things are changing rapidly. And I also need to divulge, I am a historian. And so I'm going to ask you to do something that historians sometimes don't want to do, which is forecast the future. What changes at Sewanee and with your efforts because of what's transpiring right now, as opposed to perhaps when you were having conversations in November or over previous years, right?
Well, I think that this keeps happening, that the pace that's acceptable for change keeps increasing because of the events that keep happening, because of the things that keep happening. Now, the horrible killings of over the last month and a half, these have been happening for generations in the United States. I don't want it to diminish the horror and the outrage and the criminality of what happened, but this has been going on for a while. This has been, in fact, it's better to say this has been a fabric of American life for a long time. And here we're mainly talking about the period after the fundamental and pervasive violence of slavery. So the pace and the pressure to do something is increasing, and I welcome that. Although in some ways it makes our work harder. It makes our work more consequential, but you can't really complain about that either. I don't know, even changing the Mississippi flag, which I thought I would be, 6 feet in the ground and beyond when that ever happened. I just didn't even think it was anything worth thinking was possible. But still, that is different than the kinds of real reckoning with racism in this country, with facing an honest and truthful facing of the consequences, the legacies of slavery, as we put it. That is a much deeper and political problem that in a way, changing the flag is much easier to do than to make a real difference in repairing the inequalities and repairing the violence, and not just the violence of police violence or the violence of of weapons, but the violence of poverty, of inequality, and that is embedded within our country. So I'm hopeful that a political tide has changed, but we'll see. We need great political leadership. I don't know whether that's in our future. But I will say that, there's one thing that we expect our political institutions or our political life to deliver or wish for it to deliver. But there are other things that private entities can do. And here I'm talking about especially churches like your church, universities like my university. We can take up the same kinds of questions. We can make a dent in the same kinds of problems. Maybe not on our own, but by working together with others. So I am hopeful that even if I won't make any predictions about the political landscape, but I am hopeful that institutions like Sewanee and churches like yours and others whom I've talked to recently, I'm getting a lot of calls from churches these days, which is good. I'm hoping that we can make some difference there, and not just superficial or campus, purely limited to our campus. I'm hoping that we can have an influence beyond our immediate environs. Now that sounds kind of a little gauzy and fuzzy, but I do think that we can make a difference that's more than academic and more than just denominational or more than just parish in its reach. So, and I'm hoping that, I keep saying I'm hoping, because I am hoping that that the terrible death of George Floyd and others has opened our eyes, opened everyone's eyes to something that African Americans don't have to be told about, don't have to learn. So we have a lot of work to do, but it goes beyond just changing monuments, but it doesn't not include addressing the problem of monuments, however you wish to change them or address them. So it's a little long-winded and gauzy, and I apologize for that. But it's like with the pandemic, I don't dare make any predictions.
I'm reminded of a story too of is it St. Paul's in Richmond, the large Episcopal church, St. Paul's, Richmond, taking a step in the middle of the 20th century to do the dramatic thing and host a funeral for a prominent member of the African American community there, and inviting his friends and family to sit in the pews on the main floor, and all of the congregation of that church sitting in what used to be the slave gallery. And at the time, they're feeling like that was a very progressive thing to do. And at the time, perhaps it was a genuinely progressive thing to do. But also, I mean, hearing that story today, there are all sorts of things about that that I might say, well, why didn't everybody go to the black church that he belonged to? Why didn't people sit together on the floor? And I say all that to say that I realize too that what we do today, I hope will be a new step, the next step, a significant step towards reconciliation and healing of these wounds. But I can also imagine that 50 years from now or 20 years from now, people will look at the work we've done and say, well, that was nice. That was good that they did that, with the realization that there's, since that time, there's been so much more that's been opened up to us. So I guess I'm advocating humility on the front end so that we don't defeat ourselves in thinking, well, we have to do something so big that it's overwhelming.
Yes, my fellow historian questioner earlier will know that historians know all about humility, although they rarely practice it. But I think what you say is very true. And a figure who's been very influential on me, and I will confess to all of you on Facebook and elsewhere, I am not an Episcopalian. I didn't grow up in the Episcopal Church, but I'm like an honorary member or something these days. I guess I'm is Catherine Meeks at the Absalom Jones Center in Atlanta. And if you're unfamiliar with Catherine Meeks's work, I would urge you to seek it out, listen to her speeches, listen to her presentations. So she is a powerful witness for the experience of African Americans and a powerful witness for the Episcopal Church. But she came to Sewanee and took us to task in a presentation she made about the word reconciliation in our title. It says, effectively said, you won't get there. You won't get there in your lifetime. This problem is too big. So she introduced humility and a sense of our own limitations. And I don't think we were thinking we were going to create a new world of reconciliation, but it did give us all pause to think about just how steep the mountain is that we're seeking to climb, and how the weight of history is so enormous, and the inequalities and the injustices so embedded within the structures of the world that we live and we take for granted as natural. So she is a courageous and undaunted person, and a person of powerful faith that I'm truly in awe of. But for someone with all of that, it was a humbling experience and made me think about that it's important that we try to do something that matters. And then people can judge us for that. Did we try to do something that matters? We may not succeed, but it's important, especially for us as teachers, as leaders of students, and as those who work with students. We need to empower them to try to do something that makes a real difference.
Do other folks have questions? I guess I have one more if I can.
Sure, Andrew.
I was when we first started this discussion several sessions back in February, and as we've talked tonight, it's come up in a couple of ways that how we approach or our own personal histories are significant in this discussion and seem to be more significant than they are in other historical discussions. I may be wrong about that, but I know, for instance, a Latina woman who teaches English medieval literature at a university in Washington State. And I don't think anybody would say she's not qualified. She's got a PhD in the field, but somebody with a PhD in a tenured position in American history to do this work at Sewanee, I'm sure it doesn't hurt that you attended Sewanee as an undergraduate. There's this sense of like, well, who are you really in this discussion? I just wonder if you've observed that, and is that particular to this discussion in historical conversations?
No, I think that that it does make a difference. For me, teaching at Sewanee is mostly about giving to my students what I felt that the people who made a difference in my life gave to me when I was a college student. And so that's a perspective that I carry even in this work with the Roberson Project. This is part of what I do as a teacher, first and foremost. And having gone to school here and having had a mixed reaction to a mixed experience to the way in which Sewanee defined itself as a Southern college in the 1970s. That is an important part of my education. As I come back and revisit those times today and think about the longer arc of history at this university and where we're headed, in the next century. So, I will say too that I grew up in deep South Alabama, in a small town, and the history that I'm trying to understand and trying to tell in a truthful and way. Others in the past believe they were doing the same, but mine is affected by my own history of having grown up in the civil rights era and grown in Alabama and lived that in a way that makes me feel that I have repair work to do in my own life. So this is, I don't just feel that, I know that. I have much work to do. So I think that that kind of personal experience is certainly important in this work. A person with different experience could do it too. But I am comfortable doing this probably. And I guess maybe some people think that, well, if you put a Sewanee alum in charge of this, I don't know, that's some guarantee of something. But it's I consider it, especially coming at a later stage in my career, certainly one of the great opportunities of my life and a great challenge too. And I get to work with great people.
Well, and we're grateful for your presence with us tonight. Andrew, I'm sorry, I think I stepped on a question you had. Are we good or?
Not if it's going to keep us past the designated hour.
Okay.
So I can always send it via email.
And this conversation will keep going. I am sure. So. Yep. So I'm grateful for all of y'all. Thank y'all for being with us tonight. For everybody who joined us on Facebook as well, thank you all for tuning in. We will have another session in 2 weeks. Jim Dolan, who is the rector of St. Augustine's Episcopal Church in Oakland, California, will be with us. That's a historically African-American parish. Jim is a white man, a priest, and he's offered himself as a person who can help address all of the questions that you want to ask, but maybe you are uncomfortable doing. So it's a chance to ask those things that we need to get clear on. So thank you all. Y'all have a peaceful night, and we will look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you, Woody.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you
Have a
so
good
much.
night. Thanks again.
Good night.